My name is Annaliisa YT and I'm from Estonia, and I'm part of Basemini Barcelona, and I also represent two clubs in Estonia, Kalevi Yacht Club and Tallinn Yacht Club. I actually didn't sail when I was little. I never did any dinghy sailing. I only started racing maybe 6 years ago or so. And in the beginning, I joined some crews in ORC sailing class. And a few years ago, I started to wonder about the solo sailing, and I had read many books that inspired me a lot. And then at some point, I started to imagine how it would be to also try solo sailing. And then one thing led to another, and here I am. So my project has been quite short compared to many of the others. I started my qualification only 1.5 years ago. So I did all my qualification races last season, and that allowed me to be on the main list of the Mini Transat. It was a very intense year, but I learned so much, and it's been absolutely wonderful. When I started this project, I was working in a climate technology company that was based in Estonia, but I was working remotely. So whenever I wasn't racing or working on the boat or trying to get some more additional funding, I was working remotely from wherever the races took place. But around 4 months ago, I realized that preparing for this race is taking a lot of time and energy, so I had to decide to leave my job, which wasn't easy because I liked having something outside of sailing as well. But honestly, considering how short my qualification time was, it became too much. So I just had to make the tough decision and leave. And so I could focus fully on the project in the last months. My main goal is to be able to enjoy the racing, enjoy the sailing. It's not always easy, especially with my boat, because my boat is a little bit older than most of the boats here, which means that it's slower, which means that I will most likely be in the end of the fleet. And when you're out there alone, it's not so easy seeing everyone flying ahead. So I think for me it's the main challenge to, forget about that and still enjoy the sailing part, because everything else around the project, like all the learnings and everything, is worth so much more and is for me so much more important as well. So I just need to remember that, and I hope I will succeed in that. And then I will be very happy. Well, I think the biggest and most important is when you're sailing, and especially these feelings become stronger when you're on the sea alone. You see how little we are in this world and how much power the nature has. And we often don't realize that. We think that we're almighty sometimes, or we think that we can, surpass the forces of nature. But no, it's a lot smarter to let the nature guide us and be as kind to nature as we can, and hope that it will hold us well. Hello everyone, thank you very much for following me and this voyage, and I'm very happy that I can take you with me.